Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about my fellow Princetonian, Gaston Drake, as well as my predecessor as the president of the Princeton Club of South Florida. Next. On December 20th, 1955, the lead editorial in the Miami Herald was headlined, "This community owes much to Gaston Drake." And in 5 paragraphs talking about his life, it ended by saying, Gaston Drake was a pioneer of pioneers. This great metropolitan area grew out of the living and the vision of such men. This community has lost a first citizen. His name looms large in the history of Dade County. Now, I think most Miamians today, when they think about names that loom large in the history of Dade County, they think of people like Henry Flagler and Julia Tuttle and Mary Brickell, George Merrick. And Gaston Drake, except for a few of us, probably doesn't readily spring to mind. So who was this man that the Herald called a pioneer of pioneers just 67 years ago? Next. Gaston Drake was born in August of 1871 in his maternal grandparents' house in St. Louis. And Lucas Place was the prestige address before the Civil War to live in St. Louis. Next. And Gaston and his 3 brothers were all born there. Gaston, Trustin, Bertram, and John. 3 of them followed Gaston to Princeton. Next. Gaston's grandfather, Trustin Polk, was a Yale-educated lawyer who had moved to the frontier town of St. Louis from Delaware in 1835. He was a practicing attorney in St. Louis, a very successful real estate investor. And after an unsuccessful campaign for US representative in 1854, he was elected governor and then senator of Missouri, taking office in January of 1857. Next. These, of course, were tumultuous times in the US, and Trustin Polk was an unapologetic supporter of the South in the Senate. He was not present for the session that began with Lincoln's inauguration in 1861. And of course, the beginning of that term was when the Battle of Bull Run was fought. So on January 10th, 1862, the Senate voted unanimously to expel him from the Senate for sympathy with and participation in the rebellion against the government of the United States. At this point, Trustin Polk had already left Washington, had gone back to Missouri. Some of his critics argued had put his money into trust for his wife and daughters, and had taken a carriage across into Arkansas to fight with the Confederate forces over there. Next. Gaston's grandmother, Elizabeth Newberry Skinner, had also moved to Missouri in its frontier days, in this case from Connecticut. And the Polks were married in 1837. Mrs. Polk looms prominent in the history of St. Louis at this time because, again, of her sympathies for the South. St. Louis at this point was full of refugees who had fled the secessionist southwestern Missouri. And the Union Army that occupied St. Louis felt that Confederate sympathizers in St. Louis should be made to pay for the cost of these refugees. So they levied a tax that Mrs. Polk refused to pay, and the Army both confiscated her material goods and then ultimately confiscated her house and exiled her and a number of other Southern sympathizers into the South. The thinking was, hey, if they're gonna support the South, then they should be down where the South is in control. So they loaded them on this boat that you see pictured here and sent them downriver, in theory, to Memphis, where they were going to catch a train to the Southern controlled Alabama. but this was just prior to the Battle of Vicksburg. And I'm guessing train lines were not so clear. And so they deposited Mrs. Polk and her daughters and 19 other Missouri residents in the just above Vicksburg, where Grant was sort of marshaling his resources for the attack on the city. And they then went upriver in Mississippi and were ultimately captured by the Union Army when Senator Polk came across to try and rescue them. So an adventure that most women in the Civil War probably didn't have. Next. Gaston's mother, Cornelia Burdell Polk, was the third of four daughters that were born to Trustin Polk and Elizabeth Polk. And there's a typewritten history from the family that says that Gaston's mother was enrolled in the Patapsco Female Institute, that you see pictured here, in Ellicott City, Maryland, at the outbreak of the Civil War. And that in the story, she spent the war years in the home of Robert E. Lee, whose daughter Mary was an intimate school friend at Patapsco. The dates don't quite work out with this. The school closed just before, just at the start of the Civil War, when there were riots in Baltimore with the Union troops passing through. And actually the Lees left Arlington, their estate across from Washington, within a week to move deeper into the South to a plantation that was controlled by one of their other children. So I think it's unlikely that she spent the war there. There's another family history that says she spent it in a boarding school in North Carolina, which actually some of Lee's daughters also did. Next. So that was the maternal side, big because of the ties that Gaston Drake always had to St. Louis. His paternal grandfather, for whom he was named, was Dr. Gaston Drake. And he was a planter and physician in northern Alabama, northwestern Alabama. Dr. Drake and Mary Maria Moore were married in North Carolina, but by 1840, they had moved to Alabama, and Gaston's father, who was James Elias Drake, was born in 1843 in Alabama. Interestingly, Dr. Drake's had a problem with arson. Not that he practiced it, but he was the target of it. In 1847, local newspapers reported a heavy loss by fire at the warehouse at Drake's Landing, with over 1,000 bales of cotton destroyed. And the quote was, "There had been no fire at or near the warehouse during the day, and there's no doubt is entertained that the fire was the work of an incendiary." 3 years later, the local newspapers reported that Dr. Drake's large and handsome dwelling, recently erected in the eastern part of our village, this was Greensboro, Alabama, was totally destroyed by fire on Sunday night. There appears to be no doubt that this most diabolical act was the work of an incendiary. Dr. Drake expected to move in on the morning on which he found it a heap of ruins. So you can see here that the house was rebuilt, but suggests that Dr. Drake may not have been unanimously popular in his small Alabama community. In 1855, he was appointed to a committee to find a suitable site for a college of the Alabama Methodist Conference, and he served on the board of trustees of Southern University when it opened in Greensboro in 1859. Next, please. So James Elias Drake enrolled in Southern University in its first year of operation, and he was there for 2 school years through 1862. The school remained open during the Civil War, even though enrollment dropped precipitously. Perhaps because of that drop, James Elias Drake enrolled in the University of Alabama for the 1862-63 school year. Maybe that's where he finished his degree work for Southern. And he probably served in the university's Corps of Cadets because all students were enrolled. After the war, he responded to an ad that the University of Virginia had placed in 100 newspapers across the nation in 1865, and became one of 258 students who started at the University of Virginia for the 1865 term. He completed his law degree in 1867. Interestingly, family history said that James Elias Drake had served in the Civil War as a Confederate major in the cavalry and was actually wounded, received a bayonet wound that contributed to his early death. But I've gone through all of the Civil War records I can find, and I can't find any record of his service. When he died relatively young. There was no reference to serving in his eulogy. When you look at the catalogs for the University of Virginia and for University of Virginia, because that was, he has lots of classmates that served and their units are listed, his is not. And I think the closest he really came was when Tuscaloosa was attacked by the Union Army, and the cadets kind of scrambled to defend the university from being burned. And that might be where he served, but probably not as a major in the cavalry, and probably not with a bayonet wound. Next. Yeah, I'm sorry, go back to that preceding slide, would you? So he graduated from the University of Virginia in 1867, ended up in St. Louis, and joined Trust and Polk's law firm in December of 1867. 2 years later, he's made a partner, and 9 months later, he marries his boss's daughter, Polk's daughter, Cornelia Burdell Polk. And then 10 months later, Gaston Drake, named for his paternal grandfather was born. So in these days, life in the South was difficult, particularly for landowners who were suffering from Reconstruction. And not as much the case in St. Louis, where the Polks had always been pretty well ensconced, and their money came from real estate and a legal practice. But certainly for the Drakes back in Alabama, it was a difficult time. And James Elias Drake's older sister was married to Andrew Jackson Farr, who was a broker, commodities broker in Alabama. After the war, his name started popping up where liens were being placed against his property in order to pay off a mortgage. And he did what a lot of other Southern planners did in those days. He looked at Florida as a place to get away from this. And he reportedly rode a horse down and rode around Lake Harris, which is southeast of Ocala, and decided that was the place for him. And he moved the family down in the early 1870s. And his sister's his brother-in-law, who was James Elias Drake, followed him down, liked what he saw, and did the same. And moved his family down in 1874 when Gaston was only 3 years old. So this picture, this painting, and you can was of the boats that plied the rivers in Central Florida in those days in the 1870s. This one in particular is the Ocklawaha, which is a river that flows from the St. Johns, south of Jacksonville near Palatka, and then meanders its way down past Silver Springs to close to where Lake Harris, where the Drakes were settling. And these boats were really narrow, and because the water, and it had a very shallow draft because the water was both shallow and was filled with a lot of obstructions. But this was the major way to actually get into and out of Central Florida in those days because there was no other way to travel. Next. So James Elias Drake recognized this, particularly since he was attempting to ship oranges from his orange groves on Lake Harris north, that relying on these boats was a terrible way to actually sell your produce. And so he organized the St. John's, Lake Eustis, and Gulf Railroad. And the railroad's mission was to build a connection between the St. John's River down to Lake Harris so that he could ship his produce out by train. And they actually managed to clear the roadbed by 1877 when James Elias Drake died of tuberculosis. He had gone north to New York to raise money, fell ill, came back, and never really recovered. And interestingly, the railroad that he formed never actually went any further than the cleared roadbed. And 2 years later, another railroad was chartered called the St. John's and Lake Eustis Railroad. Raised money reportedly from the Astors, who were building their community of Manhattan at the one end, the one terminus of the railroad on the St. John's River. And when this railroad opened, the first engine that they bought, they christened the James Elias Drake, presumably in honor of the man who had dreamed about this railroad and actually laid the groundwork for it. Next, please. So life on Lake Harris in these days was a simpler time. You know, a lot of us have read that book. I think is it A Land Remembered? That's about early settlers in Central Florida, which I think is a good read. But this other book that I've really liked, and when you can find online, is called Three Little Crackers Down in Dixie. And it's basically the story of James Elias Drake's nephews, the sons of his sister and brother-in-law, A.J. Forrest. And the picture it paints for the Three Little Crackers: fishing and boating in Lake Harris, not swimming, of course, because it was full of alligators, gathering alligator eggs, hunting game, guarding the family's fruit orchard from marauding bears, riding their pony, interacting with the Seminoles who were still resident in Central Florida. And I think in a lot of ways, this probably described the experience that Gaston had in growing up in Central Florida. His mother had a new house built for them after his father died. And gosh, it went dark in here. Hold on. There we go. She brought tutors down from the north to educate the boys. But it was an outdoor life. And I think for a lot of Floridians, it really is a past that they have trouble envisioning now in this modern age. Next. So you can only go so far with tutors in Central Florida. And in 1883, Gaston was sent north to boarding school in Philadelphia, initially to a school called the Urey House School, just outside of Philadelphia. And later, when that school closed, he transferred to St. Luke's. And there's some articles in the Philadelphia newspapers about his athletic prowess. He played in a tennis tournament in Wilmington. In this case, in the St. Luke's field day, I think he won the javelin throw and one other contest. So he was already shaping up as a gifted athlete. And the people who ran Urey House School, it was a family named Crawford. And the family ultimately built a house in Coconut Grove, and which they called Urey Lodge, in memory of this place where they had run their school. And Gaston reportedly remained friends with them for all of his life from those early days in boarding school. Next. So, he's there at Uri House School in St. Luke's, but then in 1990 moves on to what was then called the College of New Jersey, but informally, as you can see on these baseball uniforms, known as Princeton. And he loved Princeton, and he was, as a student, he was a really good athlete. And you can see him, he's in the lower right-hand corner of this picture with the baseball team. He was a pitcher. Next. And he was a really good pitcher. He was not that much of a student, though. And he started at Princeton at the same time that Woodrow Wilson came to Princeton, his alma mater, to serve as a professor. And Wilson would then go on to become president of Princeton University, governor of New Jersey, and then president of the United States. But while he was at Princeton, and particularly when he was president, he really revolutionized the method of education that Princeton practiced, bringing it more into line with research universities in Europe. And Gaston wasn't there during that time. So he was enrolled as a special student. He, the catalog said that special students weren't working toward a degree. They were there to get a certificate in a special field like geology or some other scientific field. But I've actually looked at Gaston's grades in the university archives, and they weren't that good. And the courses he took really were kind of a scattershot of courses. It was hard to see what it was that he was doing there, other than pitching for the baseball team, which he was very successful at. Next. So Gaston left Princeton before his class of 1894 graduated. And he wasn't actually going to get a degree anyway, so there was no reason for him to hang around. He left in the fall of 1893. Just before his class graduated in the spring. And he went back to Yalaha, which was the name of the town where the Drake Point Orange Grove was on Lake Harris, and worked there for 2 years. He characterized his occupation as superintendent, which was probably correct because, of course, his father had died 20 years before. His mother had remarried, but his stepfather had a carpet wholesaling company in St. Louis. And as actually Mrs. Drake died in the fall of 1895. So Gaston was probably pretty much on his own. And of course, any Florida historian knows that this period, 1894-95, was a disastrous one for orange crops in Central Florida when severe frost killed off a lot of the trees that had been planted there. So end of 1895, his brother Trustin, who had graduated in the spring, taken a job in Pittsburgh, working for a steel company, leaves Pittsburgh and comes back to Yalaha to work on the family orange groves. And we can imagine this conversation in the family homestead. Gaston says, "Hey, I did my turn. It's yours. I'm out of here." And he goes up to St. Louis. He works as a salesman for Liggett & Meyer Tobacco Company. And then he works for a year as a salesman for his stepfather's company. And once again says, it's time to move on. And he goes to the Bahamas. Next. So his role in the Bahamas was as a fruit and vegetable broker. And in these days, the Bahamas were very productive agricultural area supplying produce to the United States, particularly pineapples. They were shipped by schooner to New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore. And Gaston was playing a role in that. You know, he was buying and selling, but he was doing other things. And so in 1900, he buys the rights to a Spanish warship that you can see here had been wrecked during the Battle of Santiago in the Spanish-American War, was being towed to, I think, Norfolk, Newport News for refurbishment by the US Navy. It sank in a storm. Gaston buys the rights and decides that he should be able to export the scrap to the United States without paying any duties because it was an American ship. And his lawyer contacts the US Treasury and says, we think we don't owe any duty. And the Treasury says, forget about it. But that was his adventure for 1900. Next page. And on an adventure back, when he's back visiting his brother, still stranded back on the orange groves, although his brother had started to grow ornamental ferns to be shipped north. But Gaston talks him into buying drilling rights for oil in outside of Ocala. And this was 6 months after the gusher that had really made the modern petrochemical industry in the US. They were obviously hoping that Florida was just like Texas and having vast arrays of oil underneath. So they paid for this, and presumably they drilled and didn't find very much. Next. So about 1902, Gaston moved his base of operations as a fruit and vegetable broker from the Bahamas to Miami, 1902. And the switch, I think, was, there were several things going on here. One, of course, with the construction of the railroad to Miami in 1896, it made Miami much more accessible both to Northerners coming south and also for anybody who's shipping produce north. So it was a logical place to be if you were going to be a broker. And I think what was at play here was he was looking at the cost of using schooners to send fresh produce north versus bringing them over from the Bahamas or up from the Keys and loading them on a train and having them in New York overnight. And I think that savviness with regard to transportation was probably a function of his father, trying to make it go with an orange orchard that he had no way to ship out except by little ferries on the Ocklawaha. And so his father dreamed of a railroad, and Gaston had one that he could use to ship produce. And so this is a picture of the Miami River looking east. You can see in the far left the Royal Palm Hotel, Flagler's Hotel there. And I think this quote here over on the side is really, again, it's such a great image of what Miami was like in those days. There is decidedly something doing in the way of pineapples down by the river. This is the Miami River. The railroad docks are covered with stacks of crates of the fragrant fruit, awaiting to be carried north, and carloads are leaving daily. Almost any time, a half a dozen or more schooners are lying at the docks, discharging large cargoes of product. The packing houses of Chase and Harney and of the Drake Produce Company are veritable beehives of industry, large forces of men being employed in both establishments in sorting, wrapping, and packaging. So this was Gaston's first business in Miami, Drake Produce. Next. And this is from the Sanborn maps for the period. It shows where his packing houses were. So the map on the right sort of shows the river, looking north. That green box on the right-hand side is the Royal Palm Hotel. And where the number 1 is, that's where the Drake packing houses were. And you can see the railroad running down there. That's where the Metro Rail runs now. Just to the right of that was Avenue E, which is now Southwest First Avenue. The bridge that you can see is South Miami Avenue. That was Avenue D in those days. So, and looking over on the left, you can see, his produce, his packing house was right on the river. And so schooners would come in from the Bahamas or from the Keys, they'd unload product, and then they would just repackage them and move them right down to the train tracks to load onto the Florida East Coast Railway for shipment north. Next. Sorry, here I'm losing my notes. So, of course, all Florida stories ultimately come back to Henry Flagler. And obviously what made this Drake produce work was that Flagler had extended the railroad to Miami in 1896 and extended it to Homestead right while Drake produce was getting off the ground. So, Drake produce didn't have to use schooners from the Bahamas to bring fruit in. They could actually bring it by train from down in the places where they were being grown in the Redlands, and then just ship them on up north. Next. But it wasn't very long from this time when he came in that the decision was made, Flagler made the decision to extend the Florida East Coast Railway down to Key West. And you can see on the left, this is a little ahead of the story, but this is part of a construction picture for the Key West extension. The thing that I see there is a lot of logs sticking out of the water, which, when you think about building a railroad that's going over vast amounts of water, 7-mile bridge, you need a lot of wood. And everyone knew that, including Gaston. And, and what was driving this, of course, was that there had been a revolution in Panama in November of 1903. And suddenly the US was in control of the construction of the Panama Canal that had pretty much ground to a halt under the French. And so Americans, Henry Flagler, Gaston Drake presumably realized or thought that Key West would grow. Key West was already the largest city, third largest city in Florida, bigger than all of Miami-Dade County. And so they saw Key West as the first American port that everything from coming through the Panama Canal was going to go to. If you have a train there to receive the goods, they just ship them north from there. And that was the opportunity that was really designed to meet. Next. So the nice thing was for a construction project that needed a lot of wood, there was a lot of wood available. In those days, the ridge that ran along the coast through most of Dade County was covered with old growth Dade County pine. And these were trees that in some estimates had been growing for 100 years. They had survived the periodic fires that would sweep through, and actually the fires hardened the wood so that they were unusually strong. Insect resistant, lots of stories how hard the wood was to work with because you just couldn't saw into it. And they grew particularly straight and tall because they didn't get a lot of nutrients. They were growing out in wetlands where there just wasn't a lot to really support them. And so they over 100 years, they grew to be really strong. So next, please. So Gaston knew about these because he was a hunter, from his days growing up on Lake Harris, and he would hunt in the pinelands that were in South Dade. He knew the quality of the wood. He knew what they could be used for. So he had the inspiration that he should create Drake lumber as a way of harvesting this wood and supplying the construction projects that were going on all over Florida at that point. So he raised $100,000 from his best friends at Princeton, and one of his best friend's business partner a guy named James McGee Perrine. And so with these Princeton investors and Mr. Perrine, they created Drake Lumber Company in June of 1906. And Drake Lumber then went on to buy the timbering rights on thousands of acres from Henry Flagler's real estate affiliate, Model Land and the Perrine Land Company, I think it was called. And the obvious question is, was there a tie between the Perrine, who was an investor in Drake Lumber, and Henry Flagler? You know, it's, all of you probably know even better than I, the Perrine grant. Congress gave that to Dr. Perrine back when South Florida was first being settled. He, of course, was killed in the Keys. His family kept the grant, fought for years to perfect the lien because the grant was dependent on putting settlers on the land. They finally won when Henry Flagler stepped in and supported them with cash and lawyers and influence in return for half of the land. And so Flagler and Perrine, very close. And this Perrine, who was Gaston Drake's investor, was born in the same place that Dr. Perrine was. I looked at the Perrine family history and I can see their common ancestor when the Perrines came over from France and settled in New Jersey. So I think it's a logical assumption that his one outside investor offered him access to Henry Flagler that let him get sign all of these timbering rights for all of its land. This, of course, is one of the engines that Drake Lumber used to haul wood out of the pinelands. And for Princetonians, what's notable, of course, is the number on the in the front there. You can see 94. Gaston Drake would have bought this engine just because it was engine number 94. Next. So the process of course, building a mill is a complicated one. Gene Taylor, who wrote The Villages of South Dade, interviewed a lot of residents of South Dade back in the 60s and the 70s. And she wrote, Mr. Drake bought a mill from a Dr. Kemp in White Springs, Florida. When he brought it to South Dade, many of the former employees, both black and white, came also. And I searched around for Dr. Kemp and I couldn't find him in White Springs, but White Springs was the center of a big timber and paper company that was founded by Benjamin Franklin Camp. Camps, big Virginians. When I went to the University of Business School, the library in the school was the Camp Library that the family had donated the money for. And Camp had built a rail line from White Springs, which is in Central Florida, over to the coast so he could ship lumber directly from the port of Jacksonville. In 1905, he bought the locomotive, the James E. Drake, that had been named for Gaston's father. And the Camps, as well as the Drakes, lived in, when they sort of away from Ocala, from Yalaha, they lived in Ocala in similar, close to one another. And there was some intermarriage between Drakes and Camps. So I think what Gene Taylor was trying to say in this, not that she knew it, but most of the mill that initially went in Princeton, Florida for Drake Lumber came from a Camp mill up in White Springs that they sold to their friend and distant relative, Gaston Drake. And the timing was perfect because Gaston was married 13 miles away from White Springs in Lake City at the exact time that he was setting up Drake Lumber and looking for a way to build a mill. So logical, he was up there on one of his marital trips and took a side trip to talk to the Camps about buying their mill. So the mill opened Yes, let's go back to that one. One of their first shipments was this one on a schooner to go north, 250,000 feet of lumber going to Elizabethport, New Jersey. This was the first lumber that was ever shipped out of Miami for a northern port. And I'm guessing that it was going to Elizabethport because, again, James McGee Perrine and his partner, Gaston's friend from Princeton, Frederick Buckalow, owned a large lumber wholesaling business in central New Jersey, not too far from Princeton. So my guess is they had first claim on this this shipment that was going out. But next, it wasn't long before this wood was staying a lot closer to home with his contracts to sell wood to the Florida East Coast Railway. So this was a note that Gaston sent to his class of 1894 on the occasion of their 15th reunion at Princeton. So 1908. Is that the right year? 4 and 5 is 9, 1909. And he says in here, the Florida East Coast Railway is straight behind us with their orders for material for the building of their road to Key West. And we cannot afford to let a trick like that pass us now. So, you know, Princetonian skipping reunions, it only happens for a big reason. And in this case, it was because this railroad was being built and Drake Lumber was helping to build it. And he couldn't afford to go away from that major client. Next. And here's a picture of some of his wood being shipped down to Key West. You can see at the top, it says carload of lumber shipped into Key West on the Oversea Railway, longleaf yellow pine, manufactured by Drake Lumber. And it's going actually to the mayor of Key West to be sold at auction, with the proceeds going to any charity designated by his honor. Mills and dry kiln at Princeton, general offices and retail yards in Miami. And in this case, it's actually sawn lumber as opposed to logs, but obviously you could ship logs on this as well. Next. So that the Key West extension wasn't the only big demand for Drake lumber. He also supplied, the Drake Lumber supplied the wood that was used to build the Collins Bridge, which at 3 miles long was arguably the longest wooden bridge in the world. Again, the story of this, another New Jerseyan, John Collins, started this as a way to be able to access his land in Miami Beach. He ran out of money. Carl Fisher was down looking for something to do after he had made his millions. And Frank Schutz, who was attorney to both, introduced them, and the rest was history in terms of construction of the bridge, and of course, Carl Fisher in Miami Beach. And Schutz was a close friend as well of Gaston Drake. So it's not illogical that when John Collins was looking for a source for lumber, he listened to his lawyer's recommendation to buy Drake lumber. Next. The Drakes were very close to James Deering. You'll see a little bit later on a picture of Mrs. Drake at the opening of Vizcaya in December 1916. And this picture was actually taken when it was open, which, as you can see, was still, the gardens were still a construction site, lots of lumber lying around there. And I've asked at Vizcaya if there's any record of dealings with Drake Lumber, and they claim that they have not found any. But, you know, this was a huge construction project in Miami, employed like 1/10 of the workforce. They had their own train line off of the Florida East Coast Railway, the main line. The spur came right into Vizcaya because of all of the materials they were using. So I think, you know, given the social ties and the accessibility to wood coming out of the Redlands, that there probably was Drake lumber wood that was used for that. Next. This operation was a huge operation. It was the major employer in South Dade, and Gaston Drake built a town around his operations there, which of course he named for Princeton. There are a lot of published reports that he painted the buildings in the town orange and black, the school colors. Unfortunately, I've never found a color photograph that confirms that. And it does seem a little unlikely that the whole town was painted orange and black, which, as much as I love those colors, I don't think I would want to live in an orange and black town. But still, it was a major community. And so in addition to the sawmill that he brought south from White Spring, he built planing mills, drying kilns, machine shops, had boilers. The town was on 80 acres of land that was adjoining the FEC rail line. The Miami Metropolis, which was a precursor to the Miami, I can't remember which one, the Herald or the News, characterized it in a full-page article as the single most important industry in the country south of Miami. And this article was written with Gaston's cooperation, but I think that was probably not an overstatement. Workers harvested as many as 350 big logs every day, and they would ship them to the sawmills using 20 miles of standard gauge railroad track. Locomotives, we saw that one that had the 94 on the smokestack. As one area would be cut over, the track would be torn up and relayed to another location. Pine trees were loaded onto a railway car with an A-frame skidder, which is what this is that you're looking at. That required 19 workers and 7 mules. Logs were sawn and stacked in drying kilns for 72 hours, which would lighten the wood because it would dry the moisture out of it. The lumber was then graded, trimmed, and tied in bundles for storage until final shipment throughout Florida. And then after the timber was harvested, Drake Lumber would offer the cleared land to homesteaders, touting the avoided cost of actually having to clear the land. Although I think there's a lot of work between having a land where the trees have been sawn down and actually being able to plant crops on it. Let's flip through some more of these slides and you can see some of the other pictures from the operations. So again, a skidder. This gives you a sense of the scale of this company town. It's a lot of wood. Hard to imagine all of this growing down there in South Dade. Interestingly, when you look at these pictures, it looks like a pretty complete mix of black and white workers. And there was a segregated portion of Princeton, but when you look at the pictures of the town, aside from the fact that blacks lived in one part of town and whites lived in the other, it's hard to tell the difference between them. And of course, the station, the FEC station for Princeton. So by 1912, Princeton was the largest community between Miami and Key West. Had 200 employees and their families, packing house, postmistress, bicycle repair shop, fraternal lodges. This station, arguably with an orange and black sign, you may remember this if you're an old-time Miamian, because this station was moved to Crandon Park Zoo out on Key Biscayne, where it was a station for the zoo train, zoo tram. And then when that station, when the zoo closed, it was moved to the Gold Coast Railroad Museum in Kendall. And actually, when I first came to Miami, I went down to find it. And unfortunately, it's now in the form of splinters because it was destroyed by Hurricane Andrew. But this station had a lot of different homes. Next. So, you know, again, the issue of Drake Lumber and its black workforce is hard to interpret 100 years later. You know, Gaston Drake clearly employed Black workers. There are reports that he paid them less than white workers, which would have probably been normal for the time. They did live in close proximity. This is a picture of the Silver Green Cemetery in Princeton, which Gaston Drake created as a cemetery for Princeton's Black families. It was the only Black cemetery within miles. And in 1917, the Miami Chamber of Commerce asked Drake and other leading businessmen who employ Negro labor to support a congressional waiver of a literacy test so that Bahamian laborers could immigrate to Florida. So, you know, clearly the Chamber of Commerce regarded Drake Lumber as a major employer of Blacks in South Dade. And so, you know, it was by law, you know, Florida was still segregated, but it's not clear to me that, well, I think Gaston Drake was probably a better than normal employer for the time in the way that he built this company town and gave people jobs and had a cemetery for them. Okay, next. So, you know, the Princeton lumber yards kept on through the teens, but by the early 20s, the reports were that the land was pretty well cut out. And I've heard stories that was probably not completely true, but certainly the land that Gaston Drake had access to, the yields were dropping. And he made the decision to move most of the mills up to Palm Beach County. And you know, in an episode that echoes what happened with his grandfather back in Alabama, a fire of unknown origin in March of 1923 destroyed what remained of Drake Lumber's equipment and building. Gaston told reporters that the damage was partially covered by insurance. So this really was the end of Drake Lumber in South Dade. And you can see 40 acres of buildings, and it ruined a large Negro settlement. So, but you know, by the time this fire came through, and it's hard not to see this as possibly something from a disgruntled former employee. Next slide, please. Gaston was on the move to Palm Beach County, and the place that he was moving to was Kelsey City, which was a planned community that was being constructed. Gaston, so he moved buildings and built new mills and processing facilities, leased timber rights on the surrounding lands on lots of like 100 or 200,000 acres. But significantly, he built this, he got it operating, and then he sold it to another company called the Indian Lumber Company in the fall of 1925 for $350,000, which probably was an okay return on what he invested, particularly since he had pulled all of his equipment out of Princeton. So Indian Lumber started shipping lumber, but installment sale was probably not a good decision on Drake Lumber's part because 1928 Lake Okeechobee hurricane swept through this part of Florida, just really affected the mills. And then, of course, at that point, you know, Florida had already started into the land bust that came as a precursor to the Depression. So I didn't see any records of it, but my guess is that they didn't actually get that $350,000 that they were contracted to. Next. Next slide.
About that.
But Gaston still lives in Kelsey City, in the Kelsey City Brewing Company, which has two beers that memorialize him. Sawmill Red IPA. When Harry Kelsey needed lumber to build a city, he turned to Gaston Drake. And then Engine 94 Imperial IPA. Drake Lumber Company was moving so much lumber through Kelsey City that a train was the only thing that could keep it up. So Drake purchased his very own. Now, I don't know whether this was the train that actually went up to Kelsey City, but it could have been. Gaston loved the number 94. So, next time you're in Palm Beach County, stop by and have a beer that salutes a famous Miamian 2 counties north. Next. He's at this point, Gaston's kind of out of the lumber business, and he turns to things that he knows from his past. One, of course, remembering those oil leases that he and his brother had bought over near Ocala in 1901. He organizes a company to go drill for oil at the 40 mile bend right on the Tamiami Trail. And they're drilling away. They get down to, I think, 4,000 acres or 4,000 feet, 4,500 feet. But their money was in the Bank of Bay Biscayne in 1930 when it failed. And lots of stories in the newspaper about trying to bail this thing out. They had public meetings in the Bayfront Park to try and educate people on the opportunity and encourage them to invest their money in stock, something that probably wouldn't happen today. But this oil company, absorbed time and money, but ultimately came to nothing. Next, please. So Gaston, he's hurting. Hard to tell how much. He led a very he led a lifestyle that would lead one to believe that he was very prosperous, and that's not cheap. So it's perfectly believable that he went into the Depression with not very much in terms of liquid assets. So he used his Princeton ties to get appointed as a prohibition agent, or a prohi in the terms of prohibition, in the waning days before repeal. His advocates were, this is Joe Guffey, who was his classmate in the class of 1894. Joe was the Democratic political boss in Pennsylvania from Pittsburgh, and ultimately was elected a US Senator from Pennsylvania. And his fellow St. Louisan, Breckinridge Long, class of 04, who was prominent in the Wilson and the Roosevelt administrations. Both these guys, early and strong supporters of Roosevelt. Breckinridge Long was actually ambassador to Italy when this took place. And these two men pulled strings to help Gaston get his meal ticket, was the way he referred to it, as a prohibition agent. It didn't last long. Prohibition was about over. And he angled then to get an appointment to the US Tariff Commission, which by law was split between Republicans and Democrats. There were a couple of openings. He thought, as a Southern Democrat, that he was a farmer, that he was a logical guy to be looking, overseeing tariffs. These were the days of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, so tariffs were a big deal in the US. But he wrote a lot of letters to a lot of people, all of which are in the History of Miami Museum, but could not get the appointment because Postmaster General and Democratic Party Chair Jim Farley nixed him, saying that he was not a visible and strong enough supporter of Roosevelt in the 1932 campaign. And so he just wasn't going to give him a plum patronage assignment like this. Next. So, the 30s are a pretty quiet time for Gaston. He shows up again in 1938 in the Herald as is he the president of this company? He's on the board, or he's a director of this company that is trying to promote the use of a fabric called ramie as a substitute for linen and cotton. Actually pretty foresighted as we get ready to head into World War II. but the company never really went anywhere. And I've read elsewhere that Ramey, although it has some characteristics that would seem to make it useful in this regard, it didn't really work as a, in a big textile kind of concern. Okay, so that was Gaston's business career. Well, gosh, we don't have much time left. So let's flip through his personal life, which is the next part, and then we'll close this off. Next slide. So some of his other businesses, Drake Lumber Yards, kept selling lumber up until 1940. He was a partner in Raley Milam Hardware with Marcus Milam, who he grew up with in Central Florida. And these were businesses he still had an interest in, but probably not a particularly lucrative one. I think he had sold a lot of the interest. So got married in 1906. He was 34. His wife was 21. She was a college grad, not insignificant, in 1906. He moved to a summer cottage on 12th Street, which is now Flagler Street, but then moved to the house where their family was born. Sorry, go back, next slide. Which the address was 1014 Boulevard, which Boulevard, of course, is now Biscayne Boulevard. Remembering that 12th Street was Flagler, so between 10th and 11th would have been 1st and 2nd Streets northeast. So on the west side of Biscayne Boulevard, looking out over the water, you can see the house in the lower picture on the left, and this big building in front is the original Biscayne Bay Yacht Club that was there. So a really idyllic existence there on the water. Next slide. 3 kids, Gaston Jr., born in 1907, Polly in 1909, Cornelia in 1912 after they had moved to another house. Gaston died almost a year after he was born. Front page news in the Miami newspapers, and a lot of very prominent families attended his funeral. Although I thought the interesting thing was that when you look at the families, it's mostly the women who came to this funeral. And the pallbearers are all co-workers, or not all, but predominantly co-workers of Gaston, which makes you wonder whether Mary was really the person who had the connections in Miami as opposed to Gaston. Lower right is the first Miami Presbyterian Church, which at that time was on the north side of the Miami River. The chapel that's to the left of the main sanctuary was built with a donation from Gaston and Mary in memory of young Gaston. Next. There's an ad in the newspapers in 1907 about lost a lady's gold watch and fob with initials Mary Robinson Drake engraved on it. This is basically between their house on the boulevard and Drake Produce's offices. Kind of makes you wonder what that relationship was between 34-year-old Gaston and 21-year-old Mary that he would take an ad in the newspaper. Hard to tell all these years later. Next. So in 1911, they sold, or they moved out of that house. I'm not sure whether they owned it, although I think they did. And they moved to a house on what is now 27th Street, Northeast 27th on the Bay. It had been built by a railroad heir named Chapin. And if you look at this map there on the bottom, you can see a big swath of territory, plots, the land's already been platted north and south of it. All that land is what Gaston Drake owned. And that little blue house was this house. So huge property right on the bay. Next. And Gaston commuted from there because this was right next to the FEC line and the Buena Vista depot. So he would go out there every day and take the train down to Princeton to supervise his mills. So really, he was the first commuter in Miami. They were at Vizcaya. She was Mary Robinson was dressed as a gypsy. When she would be introduced, she would shake a tambourine. And there are stories about them as frequent guests of James Deering, going out on his boat, being, eating there on the bay in small dinners. Next. So they owned that house until 1920, sold the land, and and you can see here, shows how all of that was plotted. Look at, there's Northeast 27th Street, Drake Avenue. All of that was where he owned the land. You can see that blue house kind of sitting in the middle of Drake Avenue. That was the house that they originally owned. Sold that house to a doctor from Philadelphia for $55,000, and the rest of the land was sold for housing. And they moved yet again, next, up to 447 Northeast 39th Street, which was the house that the caretaker for the Charles Deering's estate lived in. And you can see that map on the right. You can see Charles Deering estate on the top border. And they moved in there. They had the back of the house was a big architect put an addition on the back of the house. Next. 1925, they bought a big house in the Berkshires. Must have paid a lot of money for it in 1925, but probably regretted it ever after. You see in the newspapers, they spent some time there, not a lot. The biggest thing I think that happened in this house that affects Miamians is Frank Schutz rented this house for a couple of summers in the 30s. And it was in this house that he negotiated the sale of the Miami Herald to the Knights. So Miami history was made in the library of Ashtatula, which is a town near the Drake Orchards in Central Florida. Next. So tough times. These three articles appeared, within a couple of years of one another. The first one talks about how Mary Drake, accomplished horticulturalist, loves her famous for her roses. She rips up the tennis courts and plants rose bushes and ends up selling them at the Nautilus Hotel in Miami Beach. Second one talks about the brilliant ceremony with the Drake's daughter getting married in the Rose Garden, which after the ceremony, they entertained 500 guests for the wedding. And within a month of this wedding, Mary has an ad in the Herald selling 1,000 rose bushes for 15 cents each. So this was a woman who knew what she wanted. She knew that she was going to have this wedding. She knew she couldn't afford to have 500 guests in a hotel. She ripped up the tennis court. She planted roses. She paid for it by selling them, had the wedding, and then the rose bushes were no more. Next. Gaston founded the Princeton Club in 1926. This article from the Herald. Here's a picture of him at Hialeah, which actually Drake Lumber supplied some of the wood for. To Gaston's right, our left, is the president of Princeton, Harold Dodds, who's in Miami for a couple of weeks as the guest of Harvey Firestone, class of 23. And Gaston looks, this is 1936. He's kind of settled with himself, I think, at this point. This was in Frank Schutz's box at Hialeah. Next. So let's see, this was his granddaughter. No, this was his daughter who wrote about Gaston at the end of his life. The life in Yalaha made real countrymen of all the Drake boys. As young men, they went west to the Rockies to hunt and to the Northwest to fish for trout. Gaston Drake was never so happy in all of his life when he was hunting and fishing. And just before Thanksgiving a year ago, at the age of 83, he shot his last wild turkey with his first shot on the ground, very near where he must have shot his first one, on the ranch of his nephew, Tristan Polk, near Yalaha. So this was in 1954. Next slide. Drake died in 1955 in their house. So I think in closing, Drake was really, he was born in the Gilded Age. He came to prominence in the early 1900s. He was very successful as a young man, and he lived his life as if that success had no end. But he kind of struggled, for an encore. Princeton, Scott Fitzgerald, class of 1917, said there are no second acts in American life. And Gaston really, after Drake Lumber, he really didn't have a second act. He did a lot of interesting things, but none as successful as his first act. But in those ways, he is a very American figure. He was a master of managing his press. He was, really close friends with Frank Schutz, so the Miami Herald always covered him well. He was always looking for the next big thing, even though lots of times he missed it. He traveled a lot. So I think he really does deserve that characterization by the Miami Herald when he died, of being a pioneer of pioneers. He was the pioneer of what, of a lot of people that would follow after him in Miami in